I'd like to talk for just a few minutes about some faith traditions and the relationship in particular between ideas in Christianity and Hinduism, as in modern society we have a greater influence of non-Christian traditions on the general frame of mind or attitude or culture than we did even back when I was younger, let alone way back when. And so I'd just like to try to clarify some themes and some differences between the Christian faith tradition and the Hindu faith tradition, and suggest that people who are approaching issues today with a recognized or unrecognized influence of Hindu ideas against a traditional Christian background may be approaching topics in ways that people coming from a strictly traditional Christian background do not understand, and vice versa. In other words, it seems like we often talk about things in ways where we don't understand how the other person can possibly think the way they do, in part because I would suggest we don't have a full understanding of the background from which they are coming. And in part also, I think sometimes we don't even have a full understanding of the background from which we are coming. So I'd like to talk a few minutes about some basic ideas, just three primary ideas in the context of how Christianity and Hinduism address these topics. So first of all, let's think about some of the common themes, because all faith traditions, all religions, are addressing some common themes. One of the issues that we'll see coming up over and over is the idea of reality. And when we talk about reality, if we were writing a sentence and using this idea of reality in the sentence, the R would be capitalized no matter where in the sentence it appears, the term appears, because we're talking about things as they actually are, not as they appear to be. And so this is one of the common themes in, for example, an introduction to philosophy course, when you're talking about metaphysics, the study of reality as such, what actually exists, what exists as opposed to what simply appears to exist. And for most faith traditions, this idea is fairly easy to illustrate because most faith traditions presume that human beings are composed of body and soul. In fact, most faith traditions suggest that soul is what is primarily important. But when it comes to how things appear, nobody can see a soul. Seeing implies using the senses, and the senses are limited to physical data. And so the reality with a capital R with respect to how most people understand things to be structured is that there is a spiritual realm and a material realm. But the actual experiences that we have as human beings are primarily experiential in the sense of the physical realm. And many of us assume that certain things we think, believe, etc., are centered on based on things that have to do with the spiritual realm, but there's no way to prove that in the way we can prove that water boils at 100 degrees Celsius at sea level, etc., etc. So the whole idea of how reality is constructed. Secondly, the meaning of life. Why do we exist? What is our purpose in being here? How should we live now in the context of what our purpose is? How do we know how we ought to live? What are the primary means of understanding reality and what our place in reality actually is? What happens next? So we exist in this life. Is this the first time we existed? Is it the last time we existed? Do we come from somewhere? Are we going somewhere? Well, it might appear that we cannot affect whatever came before our consciousness, our self-consciousness in this existence. Is there anything about what we're doing now and how we're living now that will in fact affect what happens after this existence, this life ends? Or is death just the end? Is all that exists in the material world and all the religious claims about a spirit and an afterlife are meaningless? Well, in the context of all of these, another common theme is different faith traditions communicating, people from different faith traditions communicating. So, how do we communicate with people who have different worldviews? Religious beliefs tend to form a primary component, a central component. For many, it may seem the component of a person's worldview. And by worldview, I mean a small set of related beliefs by which we consciously or unconsciously interpret and judge our experiences against our beliefs regarding reality. And so there's reality with a capital R. How do we think things are really structured? What is in fact true with a capital T? Given that, how do we understand the things that happen to us, our place in society, our place in town, our place in the family, our sense of what it means to be human, what our responsibilities are as a human being at this time, at this place, etc., etc. So our worldviews, and so different faith traditions are going to frame reality differently, are going to assume, for the most part, and operate from a particular worldview perspective. And so the way they use terms may in fact be different, and the terms used may themselves be different. So today I want to comment on a couple of things related to both terms that are used that are the same, but I would suggest have very different meanings, and terms that are different in their use. And when we try to use them in different contexts, the meaning, the idea behind them may be lost and may in fact cloud our understanding of what those terms really mean. So let's think about this in the context of Christianity and Hinduism. Now, broadly speaking, we can talk about the Western faith traditions and the Eastern faith traditions. And within Christianity and Hinduism, we can find myriad beliefs and explanations for how life ought to be lived. In Christianity, even all the different traditions tend to suggest that theirs is the right way to understand Christianity, and Christianity is the way to understand reality. Hinduism is much broader, offers a much broader palette from which to choose with respect to how to approach religion, how to approach the understanding of reality with a capital R. But we're going to focus on a couple of subject areas within Christianity and Hinduism that I think we tend to gloss over differences in the modern world. Sometimes I would suggest with a loss of meaning, particularly from a Christian perspective, the degree to which Hinduism offers a wide variety of beliefs as being acceptable, even those that may appear to be contradictory, there's less opportunity for loss for reasons we'll see going forward. Whereas in Christianity, there's an emphasis in understanding things correctly now for reasons, again, that we'll see going forward over the next couple of minutes. So the first thing that we want to talk about is their basic belief in God that we find in Christianity and Hinduism. God, in the context of Christianity, is an expression of monotheism, the belief that there is one God. When the term God is used in the context of Hinduism, it's essentially being used with respect to trying to convey a meaning of Hinduism's view of reality with terms that are familiar to those who come out of Christianity, but which suggest, I believe, very different ideas. And so when God is used in the context of Hinduism and the singular, it's not really monotheism, it's monism. And we'll define each of these terms now. So monotheism, the belief that only one God exists. And this is against the backdrop of other theistic beliefs. So mono, one, theism, belief in deity, the belief that God or gods exist. Polytheism, the belief that there are many gods. And this is the way that Hinduism is often portrayed, because Hinduism, there's one video series that has a video, the land of 330 million gods. And part of that discussion, there's a debate or a consideration as to whether or not 330 million is even enough gods to be considered, or whether the 330 million is in reference to one overarching God. But again, as we'll see in just a second, it's not God in the way that Christianity understands God. But polytheism, the belief that there are many gods, is certainly endemic to the Hindu faith tradition, as was illustrated in the temple that we saw in the previous slide. Henotheism, there are many gods, according to henotheism, but only one God is worthy of worship. And there are some who suggest that early Jewish tradition reflects this. Some of the early ideas in the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Hebrew scriptures, suggest henotheism, that yes, the different lands have different gods, but it's only Yahweh, the God of the Hebrews, that is worthy of worship. Until by the time we get to Moses, we have full-fledged monotheism, that in fact there are no gods but God. Yahweh is the only God, and that then leads into the development all directly of Christianity and then indirectly into Islam. Atheism, the belief that there are in fact no gods, that the God as such does not exist. And then agnosticism, those who claim to be undecided. There's just not enough evidence one way or the other. So monotheism, when we refer to God in the context of Christianity, we're talking about one supreme being. When we talk about God in the singular in the context of Hinduism, it's not really monotheism, but monism. And here we're talking more about a philosophical framework. Monism is the belief that only one substance exists or is real, that ultimately there's only one thing that absolutely exists. Everything else either doesn't exist or is an expression of that one thing that ultimately exists. And so in the context of Hinduism, as we'll see in just a second, we really have monism, the belief that there is one ultimate reality, not monotheism, the belief that there is one ultimate God. So in Christianity, God is personal, relational, existing as a trinity. God exists. God, as understood in the Christian tradition, created everything else that is, and God desires relation. God has relation with everything else that exists. God as God, separate and distinct from God's creation, which includes us as human beings, but God existing in relation to and in relation with human beings. In Hinduism, we're talking about Brahman, the impersonal, formless, sexless, eternal, infinite, unknowable being that is reality. And so with the concept in Hinduism of Brahman, we aren't really talking about God in the way that Christianity understands God as a being that exists in relationship. It's more like the prime mover of Aristotle, the idea that there is something from which everything else emanates or derives. And the question then is, what is the relationship, our relationship to that ultimate thing? But it's a very different way of understanding that which is real, that which is supreme. In Christianity, you have God that is supreme. In Hinduism, you have Brahman that is supreme. Well, that brings us then to concepts in Christianity of sin and salvation, and in Hinduism of karma. And karma is a term that appears in common parlance today in the West, in America. When I was younger, we didn't hardly use the term karma unless you were actually studying Hinduism, but now it's part and parcel of our discourse. You can find all kinds of YouTube channels devoted to talking about karma and the immediate result of an action deemed to be typically negative, when negative results apply to the one who did an action that was deemed to be negative. But what do we mean by these terms? Sin, an act or thought against the will of God. And here we're talking about an act or thought in a way, in thought can be, for some, put in parentheses, but that which goes against the will of God. Salvation is redemption from the punishment due for committing sin. Sin, an act against God, requires punishment. The ultimate punishment being death, but death having been delayed, we live as sinners, needing to be saved. And the question is, how do we realize that salvation? For Judaism and Islam, the essential means by which salvation is realized is by obedience to the law, obedience to God's expectations. For the Christian, however, there's a different understanding. In Christian theology, human beings are guilty of and bound by sin, destined for eternal punishment apart from faith in Jesus Christ as God's offering to cover the punishment due for sin. So, for Christian theology, human beings are unable on their own to do anything to account for, to pay for the rebellion that has been expressed individually against God. That human beings are dependent upon God to provide what is necessary for salvation, and that salvation ultimately being Jesus Christ, God the Son, being offered by God the Father and willingly coming as God the Son to be born of and then ultimately crucified on the cross and resurrected. But in Hinduism, we have the concept of karma at play, the law of consequences, whereby one's deeds accrue positive or negative judgment that is meted out in this life or the next. So, with the concept of karma, one's actions are going to result in kind of either positive or negative weights against the future life. Now, the future life may be during this lifetime, or the future life may be in the next lifetime, because karma is an idea that takes place against a backdrop of how reality is structured that is fundamentally different from how Christianity and the Western faith traditions in general view reality. Move this here. Sorry, I didn't do that on the previous screen. Just the size here and the location. So when we're talking about karma, in Hindu theology, we have duties to perform in this life based on our position in life according to which we accrue good or negative karma, which is reflected in the condition of our rebirth or reincarnation. So the idea of reincarnation, most people associate with Hinduism. It's part of a kind of a multi-step process, but karma is a central element in that whole process. And the idea, broadly speaking, is that you have duties that you need to follow through on based on your position in life. And if you do those duties correctly, then you'll accrue positive karma and you'll be reincarnated, reborn into a better position so that you can continue to move up the ladder to achieve the ultimate goal, which we'll talk about in a second. But if you accrue negative karma, if you live improperly, and then result in negative karma, then you will accrue things that need to be punished, not by an eternal punishment, as in the context of Christianity, but by a rebirth in the cycle of existence in a lower life form, either a lower position on the human scale or in a lower life form in the scale of the animal kingdom. So that samsara is the journey or wandering of our soul to the next life form. When this life ends, it isn't judgment in the sense of Christianity standing before God, but judgment that is meted out based on the karma that's been accumulated, so that you are reborn into a better or worse position to realize the objective, moksha, release from this life. Because moksha is the objective, release from the cycle of birth, life, death, and rebirth. For those in the Western tradition who understand that life, that existence, that reality is a one direction timeline, and you have one life in which to get things right, Hinduism may in fact appear to be a good option. That this idea of rebirth, of samsara, of coming back and trying again may seem like a good thing, but from the Hindu perspective, that totally misses the point, because to be released from this cycle is ultimately to realize union with Brahman in the Hindu perspective. So in Christianity, the goal is eternity with God after one life. You have one life in which to live to get things right. If you get things right, eternity with God. If you get things wrong, eternity in hell separated from God. In Hinduism, the goal is union with Brahman after as many lives as it takes. So even if you do well, you may not do well enough. You may not achieve enlightenment, understanding the position to escape the cycle of life, birth, life, death, and rebirth. And so you come back. Hopefully you come back in a form and a condition where you can begin the journey of understanding further ahead than you did in your last life. If you come back as an animal, particularly a lower form of animal, then you're going to have several rebirths. And by several, it's not just a dozen or more, maybe several hundreds of rebirths until you become human again. And ultimately, you have a chance to devote yourself on the framework of the ideal Hindu religious approach to achieve an understanding that allows you to join Brahman. But the thing about this is that in Christianity, the goal is right relationship with God, eternity with God, as the individual that you are. Rightly understanding yourself in relationship with God so you can be rightly related with everything else. In Hinduism, the objective is loss of individuality, loss of the self. You as a self don't actually exist. What actually exists is Brahman. And so your self-awareness needs to end. Your sense of self needs to be totally lost. And you become one with Brahman. And so when we refer to karma, we're referring to an idea that is central to Hinduism's understanding of how reality is structured. And so to refer to karma in the context of a basically Christian Western worldview is to refer to an idea that implies multiple chances to get it right in a framework that actually says, no, you have only one chance to get it right, namely this life. So just some things to keep in mind as we consider how our effort to understand different faith traditions develops and the impact that ideas and terms in different faith traditions may have, whether the terms being used are in fact the same, or whether in fact the terms being used are different, and failure to clarify the difference may in fact cause us to lose sight of what is at stake. Well, thank you very much for taking the time to visit with me during this video. I look forward to your comments and ideas. If you have any other ideas about things that we ought to talk about, please let me know. And here you'll find a couple of other options for videos I've put out recently. Thank you all very much. Bye-bye.